As teen audiences of rock music aged, their taste in subject matter and music changed as well. Folk music appealed to an audience tired of silly novelty tunes and endless songs about love. Many of these fans were college students who were interested in more political and social issues. Folk music simply means music of the people. Every civilization has some form of folk music. Two of the early leaders in American folk music of the early 20th century were Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie. The tools of the folk artists were their voices, acoustic, unplugged guitars, and a harmonica. Their songs often told stories of the common man's struggles. They had some things in common with African American blues artists, a natural vocal delivery and a nomadic lifestyle. Where the bluesman was often homeless because he was poor, many folk artists were voluntarily homeless, choosing life on the road over traditional Americana. The leader of the 60s folk revival was a young Jewish Minnesotan named Robert Zimmerman. Zimmerman changed his name to Dylan in an effort to sound a bit less ethnic. His largest folk influence came from Woody Guthrie, and Dylan even adopted Guthrie's style of partial style of singing and part talking, dubbed the talking blues. Dylan's style of the talking blues can be heard in the song "The Times They Are a-Changin'." Dylan and his music quickly gained many fans, and his songs became anthems for the many changes that occur in the 1960s. His early style is in the traditional folk acoustic style. In his huge hit "Blowin' in the Wind," you can hear Dylan, his unplugged guitar, and his harmonica. In 1965, Dylan showed up to the Newport Folk Festival with a rock-style backup band, and he was playing electric guitar. This was sacrilege to the traditional folkies like Pete Seeger. One report claims that Seeger was so upset over Dylan's plugging in that he threatened to take wire cutters to the electrical cords. Needless to say, Dylan upset many in the folk community. He was booed off the stage at quite a few venues during this time. It is important to remember that Dylan's boyhood idols were the pioneers of rock, people like Buddy Holly, Elvis Presley, and Chuck Berry. Some accused Dylan of selling out by plugging in, but his roots were firmly planted in early rhythm and blues, so he came to this sound quite honestly and innocently. Less than a year later, Dylan was involved in a motorcycle accident that took him out of the public eye for a while. It was probably good timing, since it allowed some of the tempers and anger to dwindle away. He re-emerged with his album John Wesley Harding, which contains his song All Along the Watchtower. Be sure and listen to both Dylan's and Jimi Hendrix's versions of this song. Maybe the Hendrix version is what Pete Seeger was worried about. Hendrix is definitely a psychedelic blues artist, and his highly distorted version of the song could not be much further away from traditional folk music. Bob Dylan plugging in his guitar and helped create the genre of folk rock, but he was not the only one experimenting with this folk and rock music. Many of his friends and colleagues covered Dylan's songs, sometimes making them greater than he had. Joan Baez was the female Dylan. Her distinct high soprano helped her stand out from others in this style. Simon and Garfunkel, the Byrds, and even Scotland's Donovan embraced the new folk rock genre in their own unique ways. Simultaneously, records from American rhythm and blues icons like Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Buddy Holly, and others were making their way to England and inspiring an entirely new group of youths. Great Britain was experiencing the after effects from the Second World War far into the decade of the 1950s, with continued rationings, neighborhoods in rubble, and a depressed economy. Liverpool was especially hard hit during the war, since it was the primary port city for supplies from America. A benefit from Liverpool's international port status was that music from America found its way into the market here first. As a side note, the 45 record was social currency of the 50s and 60s throughout the US and the UK. Young collectors would meet and discuss the latest records from their favorites, much like social networks function today. Keep in mind that radio was limited and outright banned in England, and many people had to wait days or weeks for new records to arrive. So the songs they did have were traded, shared, and played over and over again. The greater your record collection, the more likely the higher your social status would be. These slides highlight some of the British music styles and bands that flooded the airwaves throughout the 1960s. Only the truly best of these made it to the US airwaves, though. Some of the groups, like Herman's Hermits, maintained a distinctly British quality, while other groups, like the Animals, completely embraced the American blues sound and recorded many cover versions of blues standards. Like many other groups forming in the UK, a group of young men who attended Quarry Bank High School in Liverpool hoped to be the next big thing in rock music. They too were inspired by the sounds from American rhythm and blues pioneers, but they quickly added their own style and wrote their own songs, eventually becoming the most well-known band on the planet. The Beatles' story is vast, and only a brief overview is capable here. Their career can be roughly cut in half, with the first years of the 60s comprising their live touring years. The second half, after August 1966, is when the group remained in the studio recording some of the most innovative music of the time. They remained together until their split in 1970. It is important to understand the differences between why the Beatles stopped touring and why they ultimately broke up as a band. The reasons are not the same. The modern touring industry did not exist when the Beatles toured the world, so many of the problems they experienced had no precedent. Equipment was inferior. They could not hear themselves over the screams of the fans. Fans could not hear them. Airplane engines blew up. George Harrison hated flying. Fans let the air out of the tires of vehicles intended to transport the Beatles away after shows. They received death threats in both the Philippines and Japan for inadvertently insulting those countries, and John Lennon's Jesus comment almost got him killed in the 1960s. These next few slides summarize some of the touring years, Beatlemania, and John's Jesus comment. The Beatles' final public concert was held at Candlestick Park in San Francisco on August 29, 1966. They all decided enough was enough and that they could expand their creativity by remaining in the studio. The next few slides highlight what many rock scholars call the greatest album of all time, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. The idea was that this Sgt. Pepper's Band, the Beatles in a new persona, would go on tour via the album in place of the actual Beatles. It seemed a bit far-fetched, but it certainly worked. As you review these slides on this revolutionary album, be sure and listen to the tracks that are highlighted. This is also an album that should really be listened to in its entirety with good quality headphones. The Beatles only had 4-track recording capability in 1966 and 67, but along with the contributions by their producer George Martin, they created unheard of sounds for a rock album of its time. Two additional tracks recorded during the Pepper sessions, but that did not make it on the album, were Lennon's Strawberry Fields and McCartney's Penny Lane. They were released as singles and included on the Magical Mystery Tour album. The Beatles' use of a mellotron in Strawberry Fields was not the first time a mellotron was used, but it does add an interesting timbre to the opening of the song. The mellotron is the woodwind-sounding opening. The beginning of the unraveling of the Beatles as a group begins with the unexpected death of their manager Brian Epstein. As the four men matured, their lives became more complicated, and their distinct personalities at times clashed. Epstein was the sole person who could keep these four men together, and with him gone, the lives of the Beatles became more distant. The album that reflects this feeling the most is the White Album. More than any other album, it has the feeling of being created by four individuals rather than a cohesive group. Unfortunately, it is also forever connected to the brutal murders in 1969 by Charlie Manson's family. The last two albums the Beatles recorded are Let It Be and Abbey Road. Although Let It Be was recorded before Abbey Road, it was released last, due in part to the group's inability to get together. Abbey Road highlights the songwriting skills of George Harrison, and is the group's best-selling album. There is more cohesion and cooperation amongst the members, which is apparent in the feeling of the album as a whole. Be sure and view the video for Something, which was written by Harrison and dedicated to all the women in the guys' lives. Caution! Yoko Ono is not to blame for the Beatles' breakup. By the late 1960s, all the men had women in their lives. They were mature, with all the problems and responsibilities of maturity. Yes, John and Yoko's behavior in the studio was unorthodox and bothersome, but it is by no means the sole reason the group broke up. Much more was going on behind the scenes regarding solo projects, who would manage the group after Epstein's death, and creative directions. For most of the members, the time was just up.